Hello and welcome, comrades. So, I wanted to make something addressing something that I briefly discussed in the last video about greed and corruption and the corruption of our political system by private corporate interests through campaign donations and how those donations might influence political figures, elected representatives. And I might have given the impression that I was treating the matter sort of flippantly, that I thought that corporate contributions, that corporate private financing of political campaigns was sort of a trivial matter. And while you'll see that I don't treat the issue with the same sort of urgency and the same sort of doomsaying that some populists that I discussed in the last video would treat the issue. I don't think it's that urgent of an issue, whereas some people might think of it as like the top issue that we need to take care of before we can address any other issues in our government and the way that the country's run. I'm not going to say that it's a trivial issue or that it really doesn't matter in the way that some people would make it seem. So to expound on what my thoughts are on the matter, I'm going to go into something of a topical issue, which this channel really isn't equipped to handle much topical current events issues. I really don't have the time to invest into producing content that would make this channel feasible as a current events topical channel. But this will illustrate the point that I want to get across. And considering the complete ineptitude of the Democratic Party, I don't think this will stop being a topical issue anytime soon. So I can take the same amount of time that it would take me to normally produce a video and still have it be relevant. But anyway, what I want to talk about is the infrastructure plan that the Democrats are trying to get passed. So the Democrats in Congress worked out a two-track legislative plan to pass a traditional infrastructure bill. When I say traditional, I mean things like roads, bridges, mass transit, highways, things like that. But to pass that infrastructure bill in conjunction with another bill with progressive priorities like childcare, lower prescription drug prices, and job training to help transfer workers to clean energy industries. These two bills are known as, respectively, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Framework, or BIF, and Build Back Better, or BBB. So, being that it's a bipartisan infrastructure bill, BIF is largely a corporate handout. I mean, after all, the only time Democrats and Republicans agree is when they're giving corporate handouts. And the only way America does infrastructure is via corporate handouts. So a bipartisan infrastructure bill is definitely going to be a corporate handout, but that's just to be expected. Anyway, progressives in Congress, meanwhile, have spent a lot of their political capital to make sure the only way BIF is passed is to pass it along with BBB, which, because it's being passed through a process called reconciliation, is really just going to be a bill of priorities from the Democratic Party. But the two main obstacles to passing BBB are Arizona Senator Kyrsten Sinema and West Virginia Senator Joe Manchin. So I wanted to get into the motivations of these two politicians because, being prominent Democratic senators, you would think that they would want to help pass the agenda of the Democratic Party and the Democratic president and deliver something for voters to make people want to motivate voters to come out for Democrats in the coming elections. But they seem dead set on just completely tanking any sort of proposals that would actually benefit people and not just pass corporate handouts. Joe Manchin is a lot easier of a case, I think, because while he no doubt is influenced by political contributions, it's also just as likely that he just has bad ideas about government. It kind of reminds me of Marco Rubio, when he was asked by a Parkland student about his opposition to gun control and political contributions from the NRA and how that might influence his position. And, his response is standard, boilerplate bullshit politician stuff, basically saying that, the NRA comes to him because of his positions. He doesn't craft his positions to the NRA just because they contribute to him. And, that can be largely dismissed. And the way he frames it can be largely dismissed. But I mean, that is pretty reasonable, though. I mean, the NRA is going to donate to people that agree with their agenda and agree with the interests of the industries that they represent. Because let's be honest, the NRA doesn't represent gun owners; they represent gun manufacturers. But that's beside the point. So while I think that, maybe Marco Rubio's position is influenced by contributions from the NRA, because the NRA is against any sort of legislation inhibiting gun ownership. Even if the rank and file of the NRA supports mild reforms, the NRA as an organization completely just rejects any sort of infringement on gun ownership and gun sales. Let's be clear about the sales part. That's what they're interested in. So maybe without those contributions, Marco Rubio would have a position closer to the actual mainstream of the population and actually the mainstream of gun owners, in that they want some sort of control on gun sales. Maybe he might have taken that position without the contributions, but with the contributions from the NRA, he takes the NRA's position, which is outside of any constituency that you could point to. So he's representing the interests of industry, which have their interests represented by the NRA, which contribute to his campaigns, and he's not representing any sort of constituency. And I think that can actually largely explain Joe Manchin. I could imagine that Joe Manchin might support this or that legislation that isn't completely crafted in the interests of corporations and private wealth accumulation, but maybe an inclination that he has toward any sort of even slightly progressive positions might be canceled out by contributions that he gets. But I think it's just as likely that he just has shitty ideas. I mean, is the fact that he is personally invested in industries that would be negatively impacted by an increase in the minimum wage, is that the reason he would vote against increases in the minimum wage? Is that something that could be fixed by getting money out of politics? I mean, people do have personal interests that they don't need contributions to reinforce. They have personal ideologies. I mean, people are ideologically pro whatever you want to call free market, pro corporate interests. People do have those interests. And maybe that's sort of a manufacturing consent sort of situation. Maybe that's from capitalists propagandizing our entire culture. But is that a campaign finance issue? No. Is being personally invested in the service sector, in hotels and restaurants that are going to be negatively impacted by an increase in the minimum wage, is that a campaign finance issue? No. Is having pre-existing ideas about how the role of government in regulating industry, is that a campaign finance issue? No. So right off the bat, I think that getting money out of politics, changing the way political campaigns are financed, that's not going to be quite the panacea that I think some populists want to believe that it will be. So with that in mind, I think that we can get into Kyrsten Sinema, who is a lot harder case because she has a previous history with progressive bona fides. She was a member of the Green Party. She often spoke in support of campaign finance reform, spoke in support in increasing the minimum wage. But we all remember the extravagant way in which she decided to tank any hopes of getting the minimum wage increased. So, what happened? I mean, yeah, there's been a lot of attention paid to the fact that she gets a lot of contributions from industries that would have their profitability negatively impacted by reforms that she previously agreed with. And yeah, it's completely reasonable to say that her position has changed because she now listens to special interests because they have shown her a lot of love. And yeah, it's really naive to think that she has genuinely made the calculation that voting this certain way is in the best interests of Arizonans or Arizonans, whatever. And that she's just, really concerned about the deficit and the debt and all those other talking points. I mean, she did, after all, after voting down adding an increase to the minimum wage to COVID relief bills, she did get an invite. Actually, her and Manchin got an invite to to an event hosted by the National Restaurant Association. And recently, Sinema has received almost $1 million in donations, including a large portion of that coming from the Chamber of Commerce. And while she has received plenty of money from private corporate interests, the recent rush to contribute to her surrounding negotiations for BBB makes it clear these donations are meant to influence her. She's been getting a lot of interest paid to her with who she's been speaking to, who is allowed to have access to her, who she's not speaking to, who is not allowed to have access to her, what she has said in basically admitting that she is listening to business interests and not the interests of voters. For example, when talking about the PRO Act, she has concerns that the bill would be a disruption to the workplace and the business environment, and says that she listens to business interests, interests of voters. I don't know. I mean, what is that? Who are they? But the big push from corporate interests who have been courting Sinema has really come in earnest with negotiations surrounding BBB. The Chamber of Commerce, for example, in a statement, said that the U.S. Chamber supports elected officials based on their position on issues important to the business community and their commitment to governing. And going back to the point I was making earlier about how people just genuinely have pro-corporatists ideas, not getting into the issue of how they developed those corporate interests or the way in which our society has been shaped to be so concerned about corporate interests. Some people would say, well, why shouldn't politicians listen to the interests of corporations? Why shouldn't they be looking out for private interests? Because they genuinely believe that, what's best for corporate America is what's best for America. So you could hear that and say, well, it makes sense why someone like Joe Manchin, why Republicans, pretty much 100% of Republicans, and why some more moderate Democrats similar to Joe Manchin would be looking out for corporate interests, because there is a constituency for that. But Kyrsten Sinema, that kind of pro-corporate rhetoric doesn't really make as much sense because of her history of, saying that we need to rein in corporate interests and we need to raise the minimum wage and do these other reforms that the business community doesn't like. I mean, so yeah, what's that about? It's got to be the contributions, right? And you look down the list of industries that contributions to Kyrsten Sinema come from: banking, other financial services, insurance, pharmaceuticals. I mean, on the pharmaceutical industry alone, Kirsten Sinema has, talked about the cost of these infrastructure bills and the cost of BBB. And if her and other sort of centrist Democrats like her were concerned about the cost of BBB, allowing the government to negotiate drug prices would save an estimated $700 billion over 10 years. BBB would allow Medicare to negotiate with pharmaceutical companies. And Kirsten Sinema has received hundreds of thousands of dollars from the pharmaceutical industry in just the last couple of years. In the end, with bills like BIF or BBB, we're really talking about sort of softening the edges of our society. And if the progressives got everything that they wanted in terms of the social safety net and spending on their priorities, what's really going to change about class politics in this country? The rich might have to pay more in taxes. Okay, great. Workers might get some protections against extreme forms of exploitation. Great. Workers might get benefits that they previously didn't have. Great. And yeah, if it's ever going to happen, the overthrow of capitalism isn't going to take place next year. So in the meantime, it'd be nice to have things that would make us at least a little bit closer to the rest of the developed world in terms of a social safety net and basic protections for workers and all that. If we really want to transform this country, I don't think that getting rid of private financing of political campaigns is really going to quite cut it. Because what I was alluding to in the previous video was something that I'll probably get into in further detail in a future video of a capital strike. Basically, private industry has complete control over our economy in ways that I touched on with, how they control taxable income, and so in turn basically determined what kind of revenue the government gets, and I don't think something like the BBB is going to precipitate a capital strike that would completely bring the government to its knees and make it reconsider its policies. We're basically not even close to reforming our society in even the mildest sort of even the mildest form of social democracy or anything like that. I guess the point I'm trying to make is, yeah, getting money out of politics would be objectively a good thing, and it would be objectively a good thing to get people representing us in government who will actually put workers' concerns on the table because they're allowed to, because they don't have to fear being cut off by their corporate backers. But if there was really an attempt to, in earnest, pass even a mild social democracy platform in the vein of like Bernie Sanders or members of the Squad or something like that, those kind of reforms may just very well precipitate a capital strike that would completely devastate the economy and devastate the ability of the government to enact such reforms. You could look at an example like what happened in response to the Meidner plan in Sweden. Yeah, I mean, I guess I up until recently sort of looked at getting money out of politics as like the top priority because, after all, we can't get anything done if corporations can just buy off our politicians and stop any sort of reforms, before they even get off the ground. But, in retrospect, that's a little naive. I mean, not quite as naive as thinking that, these politicians are actually principled and, they're actually looking through the balance sheets and seeing if this works for their constituents and political contributions have nothing to do with it. I mean, it's not quite as naive as that, but thinking that campaign finance is a panacea is also pretty naive when you kind of understand to what extent private corporate interests control our economy and not just through their influence of politicians. But anyway, I guess I'll leave that to another time when I don't have to make a video so topical and produce it in such a short amount of time. Anyway, so until next time, thank you in solidarity. Take care of yourself and each other.